Star Walker Studios presents Game Master's Journey, your multi-dimensional RPG podcast. Hello, fellow gamer. Welcome to episode 126 of Game Master's Journey, your multi-dimensional RPG podcast. I'm Lex Starwalker, and on this show, we discuss the craft and art of game mastering. Not only do I pass along any wisdom I've gained over 25 plus years of running RPGs, I also share wisdom from guest GMs and listener GMs like you. Today, I'll give my full review of Storm King's Thunder, the new published D&D campaign by Wizards of the Coast. So this is the second episode of Season 7 of Game Master's Journey, still getting settled in to the new studio and really looking forward to what Season 7 has in store. Now, before I get into talking about Storm King's Thunder, I want to let you know about a few topics I'm going to be covering in future episodes, and I'd love your thoughts on these topics. So each of these topics has a thread on the Game Master's Journey community where you can go and share any feedback or any input that you'd like to give on that particular topic. So the first one is gaming in between sessions. And this is a topic that a lot of you are interested in. And this is about how to keep your players engaged with the game in between your scheduled sessions, whether you're playing together physically as a group or playing online. You know, how do you keep the players interested in the campaign and thinking about the campaign and thinking about their characters in between sessions? And many of us are adults playing and or running these games, and it's often the case for whatever reason that you have to miss a session. So maybe you normally play every week, but you have to miss a week every now and then. Some people play only once a month. So especially if you're playing more infrequently, it can be really helpful to have some strategies on how to kind of keep everybody's minds on the campaign in between sessions. And that way, when you get together to play, you don't have to spend half an hour kind of bringing everybody up to speed on what happened last week and what's going on, because it's more fresh in people's minds because they've been thinking about it since then. So I'm looking for any ideas or strategies, especially things that you've used in your games and have found to be successful, ways to keep players engaged in between sessions, ways to encourage role play in between sessions, and any kind of activities or anything that you've come up with that you can do either individually or as a group in between your scheduled sessions. Another topic I'm going to cover in a future episode is just questions about my homebrew world of Primordia. So I've done a lot of talking about homebrewing on this show, and I use my own D&D world Primordia that I'm creating as kind of an example and a launching point for discussions about world building. And so again, there's a thread on this on the Game Master's Journey community where you can submit any kind of questions you might have, whether it's just a specific question about how something is in Primordia or a more general world building question, whether it's just something you're curious about the world or a topic you'd like me to address. Let me know. I've already got quite a few questions, and I may do just an episode where I cover them, or I may use those as inspiration for future world building episodes and segments, or probably a little bit of both. And finally, the final topic I want to bring up for a future episode is a discussion started on the Game Master's Journey community about what to do if you're in the middle of a campaign and you realize that you've given the player characters too much stuff, whether that's money or magic items or equipment or whatever, you know. And I think a lot of us, or maybe all of us, have been there as a GM, especially I think newer, you know, less experienced GMs tend to do this. I know I did this a lot back in the day, where you're just being overly generous and you're handing out magic items and gold and all this stuff. And you get to a point where you realize that you've gone overboard And now it's become a pain in the ass for you as a GM because now the player characters are more powerful or more connected or influential or more rich than they should be. And it's making it much more difficult for you to properly challenge them. And it's kind of skewed the power curve of your campaign. And so we had a GM in the community that was in this situation and was asking for ideas on how to deal with this. And I threw out some ideas and some other listeners threw out ideas. And I thought it was a pretty interesting topic. And I think that this is something that goes way beyond D&D or even just fantasy gaming. I think pretty much any RPG I've played, at least, equipment is part of it and money is part of it. And you can overdo it as a GM when it comes to giving characters rewards. And so assuming you've done that, how do you fix it? So if you have any thoughts on that, please let us know. Again, there'll be a thread in the Game Master's Journey community, and I'll have links to all these threads in the show notes for this episode 126, at starwalkerstudios.com/Game Master's Journey. So lately, I've been using the poll functionality on the Game Master's Journey community, just throwing out random multiple choice questions I come up with to see how you all respond. And I thought it would be interesting to share these on the show. So a poll I did recently was, of the published campaigns for 5th edition Dungeons and Dragons put out by Wizard of the Coast, what's your favorite so far? So the choices were Tyranny of Dragons, Princes of the Apocalypse, Out of the Abyss, Curse of Strahd, and now Storm King's Thunder. And as of recording this, we've had 29 people weigh in on this. And here's how it came out. So number one by far, getting 55% of the votes, was Curse of Strahd. And the next closest was 14%. So Curse of Strahd just head and shoulders above the rest as far as people who voted their favorite campaign for 5th edition so far. And did I vote on this? I did. I voted for Curse of Strahd. Definitely my favorite. Very, very well done adventure. Honestly, the biggest criticism, and it's not even a criticism, the biggest possible negative I can give you about Curse of Strahd is that it is relentlessly gothic horror. So, you want to be sure that you and your group are down to strap in for a gothic horror ride that's going to be that long. But if you're into that, then I think Curse of Strahd is an adventure you'll love. All right, so Curse of Strahd was way above everything else, and everything else was kind of clustered together. Second place was tied at 14% of the votes, and that went to Princes of the Apocalypse and Storm King's Thunder. Third place with 10% of the votes was Out of the Abyss, and last place with 7% of the votes was Tyranny of Dragons. So again, they're kind of clustered at the end. So we got Tyranny of Dragons, 7%, Out of the Abyss, 10%, Princes of the Apocalypse and Storm King's Thunder tied at 14%, and then Curse of Strahd at 55%. So if you would like to participate in these polls in the future, just join the Game Master's Journey community over on Google+, and just keep an eye out. I try to post one every week or so. So we've got a few of them running right now, and I'll cover those in future episodes.
This is Matthew Colville, and you're listening to Game Master's Journey.
I want to give a quick shout out to the patrons of Starwalker Studios. The support of the patrons makes this show possible. If you enjoy Game Master's Journey and you'd like to give a little back, becoming a patron is a great way to do so. Patrons get some cool perks like game material I make for Primordia and access to a special monthly podcast I produce just for the patrons. I'd also like to give a huge shout out and thank you to my Tier 4 patron, Mr. Steve Strickland. Let's hear it for Steve.
Yeah.
Yes.
You the man.
Thank you so much, Steve, and thank you to all the patrons. You can find out more about becoming a patron by clicking on the Patreon button at the top of the show notes at starwalkerstudios.com. All right, so today I am talking about Storm King's Thunder, and I'm going to do as complete of a review as I can do on the show without this episode becoming monstrously long. There is a lot in this book. There's a lot to cover. I'm not going to be able to discuss everything, but I'll try to do my best to kind of give you a good overview of what is in this book and help you decide whether or not this is something that you want to look into for yourself. Now, this is actually the second episode in which I've discussed Storm King's Thunder. I gave kind of a preliminary, not really a review, but my preliminary thoughts on this adventure in episode 123. So if you haven't listened to that, definitely go check that out. One of the things I really like about this adventure are some of the innovations in how it's presented and how various things are done in the adventure. And I talk about those in more detail in episode 123. I'll mention them today, but I'm not going to rehash a bunch of stuff I already said. So if you want to find out more about that stuff, go check out episode 123. Now, I will tell you, I have not run this adventure. I've read most of it. I haven't even read all of it. If you guys had to wait for me to read the entire thing, it would no longer be relevant by the time I was able to do the review. But I have read the majority of the adventure. I think I've got a pretty good grasp of it. You know, it's kind of interesting, you know, when these products come out, like usually the week that one of these products is released, there's a ton of reviews on podcasts and blogs and whatnot. And a lot of times these reviews are by people that have only flipped through some of the pages, only skimmed it. Very seldom are those reviews from someone who's actually read the whole thing, much rather, you know, run the adventure. So obviously because I haven't run the adventure, I can't really speak a whole lot to how this is going to play at your table. You know, the only way I could really give a truly informed review of that kind would be to run the entire campaign myself, which would probably take at least a few months, if not a year, and then get back to you. So that's not possible. Hopefully there's someone out there that's running the entire campaign and will give a good, thoughtful review of it once they're finished. But I can review it as far as my experience with it, reading the book, and you can take that and do with it what you will. So I thought I would start out talking about the structure of this adventure a little bit, because I think that this campaign has a rather interesting structure. And first of all, before I get into that, let me just say that probably throughout this review, I will be using the terms adventure and campaign interchangeably. In the strictest sense, I would say that an adventure is one arc and a campaign is made up of multiple adventures. So Storm King's Thunder, the product, is a campaign, and within that campaign are numerous adventures. However, it's just hard to always keep that distinction. So a lot of times if I say campaign or adventure, it's usually I could mean either. It's interchangeable. So just because I say adventure doesn't mean that I'm not talking about the entire campaign. So I hope that's not confusing, but I think most of us kind of use those terms in that way. A campaign is a campaign, but an adventure often can refer to a single adventure or a larger adventure like Storm King's Thunder, what we would normally call a campaign. But anyway, enough of that. So we start out, chapter 1 of the book is a short introductory adventure called A Great Upheaval. And this can be used to get your player characters from level 1 to level 5. So like so many of Wizards campaigns, the campaign proper doesn't really start at level 1. This one starts at level 5. And we saw something similar with Curse of Strod, where the story proper starts at a higher level, but then you're given an optional adventure that you can use if you want to start at first level. I don't really understand exactly what the thought process is behind this. Why not just start the thing at first level? And the problem I have with this approach is I don't know if it's true or not, but it tends to give me at least this perception that not as much thought or work was put into this intro adventure as was put into the rest of the campaign. It makes it seem like it's an afterthought. So in Storm King's Thunder, we have a Great Upheaval, which is chapter 1. It's the intro adventure, and it kind of seems like an afterthought. And similarly, in Curse of Strahd, we had the Death House adventure, which was in a lot of ways very different from the rest of the campaign, and just kind of seemed like it was tacked on. So I'm not really sure, what the reason is behind this. Why don't we just start at level 1? Why do we say the campaign starts at level 5, but then we have this optional adventure to start at level 1? I don't really know. Whatever. So this is following that trend. So something, though, that's done in this that's different that they haven't done before is, okay, the campaign starts at level 5. You're given a Great Upheaval that can get you from level 1 to level 5 if you want to do that. But you're also, at the back of the book in the appendices, you're given some thoughts on transitioning to Storm King's Thunder from one of their other published adventures. Now, by far the most successful of these are the guidelines that you're given for using Lost Mine of Phandelver. And this is the adventure from the beginner box or the starter set. I can never remember which one it's called in D&D, because Pathfinder has them, Star Wars has them, now D&D has them, and they all call them something almost the same but slightly different. But you know what I'm talking about. Lost Mine of Phandelver is part of that product, and it works perfectly because if you play through Lost Mine of Phandelver, you end up at level 5, which is where this starts. So there's a very nice section that talks about how you can go directly from Lost Mine of Phandelver into Storm King's Thunder, and goes so far as to give you various hooks that various NPCs can give you to get you started. And honestly, to me, I felt like the connections between Lost Mine of Phandelver and Storm King's Thunder were at least as good, maybe even better than the connections between the included intro adventure, A Great Upheaval, and the rest of the campaign. I almost feel like you'd have a better campaign if you started with Lost Mine of Phandelver instead, which is odd. They also give similar pointers for transitioning into Storm King's Thunder from Horde of the Dragon Queen, Princes of the Apocalypse, or Out of the Abyss. Unfortunately, these are far less successful than the guidelines given for Lost Mine of Phandelver, mainly because these are campaigns that take the player characters to like level 15 or something. So the assumption here, and this is a strange assumption, and I'm sure we can all imagine where this assumption is coming from, but it's still kind of strange. The assumption here is that you've started running one of these other campaigns with your group, say Horde of the Dragon Queen, Prince of the Apocalypse, or Out of the Abyss. You've gotten to about level 5 in that adventure, and now this new shiny thing, Storm King's Thunder, has come out, and you've decided that you want to do that instead. But you don't want to start over with new characters, so you want a way to just shift gears and go from one campaign to the other at level 5. So some thoughts are given on doing that. And I guess for the, I would assume, handful of GMs out there that this might be relevant to, maybe that'll be helpful to you. But I don't think it's going to be terribly helpful for most people. So I appreciate the thought behind this, but I do feel like it was a bit of a waste of effort and, more importantly, valuable space in this book to do this. You can't finish one of these other modules and then go into Storm King's Thunder because, again, you would be level 15. Instead, like I said, the writers seem to be assuming that you've started one of the other modules and then didn't get very far in it. And now for some reason you want to switch to Storm King's Thunder. So if you got to level 10 in one of those other modules, there's not really any help here for you. Or if you only got to level 3, it's only if you're at that magic level of level 5 that you can switch over. And it's pretty hokey, really. Right? I mean, let's just take one example, the one I'm most familiar with. Tyranny of Dragons, you're in Horde of the Dragon Queen. You're finding out about this terrible plot to free Tiamat, and all of a sudden you're just going to be like, fuck that. We're going to go after these giants instead. I mean, I guess it could happen, but again, it seems like that's an outlier, the group that would happen with. So why are we devoting page count to this other than to try to cross promote other products, which is the obvious answer, but it's not a very satisfying one. So again, the advice it's given as far as how to do this is decent advice. So if you do find yourself in that position where you're at the magic level of 5 and you want to switch to the new shiny thing, there is some help given for you. But I just really have to wonder, how many groups is this going to be relevant for? Now, on the other hand, I want to reiterate that the advice on transitioning between Lost Mine of Phandelver and Storm King's Thunder works much better, as you can finish Lost Mine of Phandelver and then go into Storm King's Thunder. And I know a lot of groups start out with Lost Mines of Phandelver, and there's been a lot of requests from the community for a continuation or what to do next out of that, because you have all these groups, they start out probably their first time playing 5th edition. They do Lost Mine of Phandelver, they get to level 5, and they kind of want to keep playing those characters. And maybe that DM isn't ready to come up with her own adventure from scratch, and she wants something else that she can segue into. Well, now you've got that. And I think this was a brilliant thing to do. I don't know that Wizards needs to or should even try to tie their future campaigns in with every single adventure they've published, but tying them all into the beginner box, especially if you're not going to start your current campaign at level 1, or you're going to have some kind of tacked on thing for level 1, I think it's a great idea to tie those into the beginner box adventure, because again, that's where a lot of new players and GMs are going to start. So that makes a lot of sense. And I hope they continue to do that in future campaigns that they release. All right. So once the PCs are level 5, whether you've run a Great Upheaval or Lost Mine of Phandelver or some other adventure, or you're just starting the PCs at level 5, which level 5 is a great place to start player characters in 5th edition, then at that point, you have 3 choices on where to go or where to start the campaign. Now, these are choices that you make as a dungeon master. This isn't a choice that the players make or that the player characters make, at least as it's presented in the adventure. Now, if you're starting with a Great Upheaval, or I suppose if you're starting with Lost Mine of Phandelver or something else, you could easily do it in such a way that you present all 3 options to the player characters and let them choose. But that's not the way it's presented in this adventure. So your 3 choices of where you want to start, if you're starting at level 5, or where you want to go to after Lost Mine of Phandelver or after a Great Upheaval, your 3 choices are Bryn Shander, the Golden Fields, or Tribor. So this is kind of nice because you can pick the location, or more directly, you can pick the adventure that you want to start the campaign with. Each of these 3 adventures / locations basically involves a giant attack that the PCs hopefully get involved in. However, the downside of this is that chances are pretty good that you're only going to use one of these 3 locations. Although it is possible that the PCs could go to those other locations during the course of the campaign, and if they do so, you can then run those encounters if you want to. But I do think that it's possible, and maybe even likely, that a lot of GMs running this are only going to use one of those 3 locations and one of those 3 sets of encounters. So this leads us to one of the strengths, and at the same time, one of the weaknesses of this product. And I think opinions are going to vary among us whether we consider this a strength or a weakness. And that's that, you have 3 decent sized sections on these areas and the encounters within them, but it's likely you're only going to use one of them. And this crops up again in this campaign. There's another part of the campaign where I think it's 5 different chapters, and each of those is an adventure. And to complete the campaign, to follow the story thread through the campaign, the PCs only need to do one of those 5. So, in the very beginning, you've got 3 chapters you may only use one of. And towards the middle to end of the campaign, you've got, I think, 5 chapters that you may only use one of. Now, again, with those 5 chapters, the PCs could go do some of the other ones if they wanted. but they don't need to. And there's really nothing in the campaign itself that's really kind of pointing them to doing more than one of those. So again, you're going to have your own opinion on whether you see that as a strength or a weakness. Is it a good thing in your mind that there may be as many as 6 chapters in this book that you don't even touch? Or is that a good thing because, maybe you can use those in a later campaign, or maybe you're actually going to run this campaign more than once. And then, hopefully the next time you run it, you'll do different chapters. I don't know. That's up to you. Now, from the perspective of a DM who's going to run this campaign, I'm really not sure where I stand on this. I think I'd actually have to run the campaign, and only after I'd finished it would I feel like I'm qualified to give an opinion on whether I felt like I used enough of the material in the book to make me feel good about it, or whether I came away feeling like, oh, there's a good chunk of this book I didn't even use. And maybe I would have been happier if the book would have been shorter and cheaper, or maybe I would have been happier if those 6 chapters would have been devoted to things like more NPCs and more magic items and more player character abilities, or more information on the various locations used in the adventure and the various locations in the north, and more encounter tables and things like that. Things that I would actually use, as opposed to all these pages that I didn't even touch. So I don't know. So I'm a little unsure of why the adventure is structured this way, especially with your 3 choices for where to begin, because again, as presented, it's not a choice that the player characters make. Now, later in the adventure, where they have 5 different adventures they could do, that sort of makes more sense to me, because it's like, well, it's giving the player characters options, and it's trying to make this adventure feel a little less linear, a little less like a railroad. And I get that. But this choice in the beginning that the DM has of, here are 3 ways that you could start this campaign, I don't know that I really get that, because as a DM, you get 3 options, but is that really that important? Wouldn't I rather have 2 more chapters with more information I can use? I don't know. Now, like I said, you could run this in such a way that you give the player characters these 3 options to choose from. But I will tell you that if you're going to go that direction, you're going to definitely need to work on the hooks for the adventure, because basically the hooks as written for these 3 different settlements, or these 3 different beginning adventures, are all pretty much the same. So if you're going to provide all 3 to the player characters, you're probably going to want to not have all 3 locations have the same basic hooks. Now, again, the PCs could come across the other 2 locations that you don't use later in the campaign. And if you want to, at that point, you could run those encounters. So just to get us back to the structure here, we start out chapter 1 is an optional adventure, takes PCs from level 1 to 5. Chapter 2 has these 3 different locations, which actually I misspoke earlier. I said they were 3 separate chapters. They're not actually. Chapter 2 is just one big chapter that's got 3 different parts for each of the locations. But later, when they have choices, there are 5 separate chapters, 5 separate adventures. So once you've completed chapter 2, whichever location you did, the PCs are now level 6, and you're ready for chapter 3. And this chapter is called The Savage Frontier. And in this chapter, you're given a list of locations that are in the area in alphabetical order, as well as random encounter tables with random encounters. So if you're familiar with Curse of Strod, for instance, it's the same kind of thing. You're given a random encounter table, you roll on the table to get an encounter, and then each of those encounters have a paragraph or a few paragraphs giving you more information about what you experience in that encounter. And I really like this. This is a lot better than just, you encounter 1d6 wolves, and that's it. Instead, you're given a setup for the encounter and treasure and ways that the encounter can go and stuff like that, which is very helpful. And I really like that. So many of these locations in the north that are described, and also many of the random encounters that PCs could run into, point the player characters to important locations that are ultimately going to lead them into the next chapter or the next part of the campaign. This chapter is one of my favorite parts of the adventure, and it's a substantial chapter. There's a good amount of page count devoted to this. I love overland adventures and I love wilderness exploration. And in fact, many or most of the adventures I ran in my second edition days were exploration or travel type adventures. This chapter has a lot of locations detailed to a greater or lesser degree. There are lots of great adventure seeds in here, and some of the locations also include their own actual encounters. So this may, or it may not, make this part of the adventure seem a little sandboxy to you and your group, as your PCs can wander around the area as they wish. However, this results in that same kind of double-edged sword that I mentioned earlier, which is there's a good chance that you may not use a good portion of this chapter. Also, the adventure is still ultimately linear, as all roads eventually lead to the next chapter of the adventure. So it's that whole, many different paths to the top of the same mountain kind of thing. So yes, the player characters have choices in that they kind of can go wherever they want, do whatever they want. But in the end, they don't really have a choice, because no matter what they do, they're going to end up in the same spot. Now, of course, if you pull this off properly as a dungeon master, your player characters aren't hopefully going to realize that their choices ultimately didn't matter. But there you go. So I think, at least for this part of the campaign, that you will be able to kind of capture that sandbox feel, that feeling of, oh, we can go anywhere, we can do anything, we can just kind of explore, and no matter where we go, the DM has something interesting for us. Now, the PCs do have some objectives at this point in the campaign, but thankfully this adventure doesn't have any kind of ticking clock. And this is pointed out for you kind of in the introductory parts of the campaign, that there is no real time limit. The plots of the giants will take some time to unfold. So there's not really this sense of urgency, like the PCs have to follow the quote story quest to the exclusion of everything else. So the PCs can take as much time as they want to explore the area. Now, I'll touch on this later, but you do, I think, want to point this out to the players, because the adventure itself doesn't really make this clear. And my experience with other published adventures and things that I run of my own is that, players are going to tend to assume that what they're doing is important, and that there is kind of a ticking clock, and that the NPCs and the bad guys aren't just sitting around twiddling their thumbs waiting for the PCs to do something, that, there is this sense of urgency and we need to get on this or bad things could happen. So I think that you should just, out of character, tell the players, hey, there's no ticking clock here. Feel free to take your time to explore and do whatever you want to do. Because again, the adventure is not going to make that clear if you don't do so as a DM. And I don't think that players are going to tend to assume that. They're going to tend to assume that there is a ticking clock. So the PCs can take as much time as they want to explore. And between the locations that are described in this portion of the book and the encounters that are given and the random encounters that are given, I think a DM will have plenty to pull from his sleeves no matter where the PCs decide to go. I think that the players will really enjoy the freedom of this part of the adventure and the freedom to kind of go explore what they find interesting. However, this could kind of have a negative side to it when they later on get to the more linear part of the campaign. They may find that a little less enjoyable after they've had this taste of freedom. This chapter is also a gold mine for GMs who aren't necessarily interested in running this campaign, but are rather looking through this book for ideas for encounters, ideas for locations. Most, if not all, of these locations and encounters could easily be transplanted to your setting of choice. For instance, there's a location called the Grandfather Tree that I'm a big fan of. I think is super cool, and I'm definitely going to be using that in Primordia. Just pick it up and plop it down in Primordia, my homebrew world. Easy to do. And, this location it's a giant oak tree. Reminds me a lot of the Trees of Life in the Wheel of Time. It's this huge, gigantic oak tree surrounded by regular size oak trees and protected by dryads and centaurs. The tree has a magical nature, and this encounter is a great example of how you can add some magic to pretty much anything in your world, complete with some in-game mechanical effects. So for example, anybody who's defending this tree operates under the equivalent of a bless spell. So it's just this little flavorful mechanical thing thrown in, but it's a really cool idea. And you can kind of springboard from that and come up with all kinds of things like that for your world. There are also numerous NPCs in this chapter that you can mine for your own adventures. And finally, if you're running in the Forgotten Realms, this chapter gives you a bunch more information and details on locations in the north, so the Sword Coast North area. Now, once the PCs reach chapter 4, they're 7th level at this point, and they journey to a ruin/dungeon with an NPC that they meet. And this is kind of, getting you back on the railroad again. Now, this is a part of the adventure that I really don't like so much. I really like chapter 3. I really like the sandboxy nature of chapter 3, the Savage North, I think it's called. The Savage Frontier, that's what it's called. The Savage Frontier. So I really like it. Chapter 4, not so much. And the reason I don't so much like this part of the campaign is because this NPC basically leads the PCs by the nose where they need to go. And this feels really contrived to me. It's also an odd choice, I think, in an adventure that's giving up so many pages for redundant encounters and adventures in order to try to create this feeling of a sandbox that now, we have this NPC that's just going to lead the PCs where they need to go. So I feel like the designers are kind of stepping on their own toes here. However, one thing that I really do like in this part of the campaign are the guidelines given on running this NPC that's with the player characters for a while. Specifically, we're given guidelines on how to use the NPC in combat so he doesn't outshine the PCs or make things too easy. We've all heard people talk about the dreaded DMPC, right? And that term almost always has negative connotations. So if you're not sure what I'm talking about here, this is when the Dungeon Master has an NPC that basically adventures with the party and is really just a player character that the DM is playing. The DM can get into problems if this DMPC is overpowered or always has the answers or tries to influence where the players go and what they decide to do and things like that. Unfortunately, though, this can lead to GMs being afraid to use NPCs that travel with the player characters at all, or at the very least can lead to GMs being unsure of how to pull that off without getting into the areas of the dreaded DMPC and stepping on players' toes. So Wizards here is giving us a great example of how we can take a fairly powerful monster or NPC, something that's more powerful than the player characters, and have this character fight alongside the PCs without stealing the show. So I think that's great. And this, like a lot of things in this product, this is something that you can take and apply to any adventure that you're running. Now, once the PCs complete chapter 4, they've advanced to level 8. And this is where they have that choice I mentioned before of 5 different adventures. And this basically boils down to there are 5 giant lords, and they can go after one of them or all of them if they want to. And each of these adventures is covered in chapters 5 through 9. Each of these giant lords is a different type of giant. So this is kind of cool because your player characters can decide, do we want to go after a fire giant? Do we want to go after a frost giant? What kind of giant do we want to go after? So this is giving them a real choice in, kind of what kind of adventure they want to have. I mean, obviously they don't know down to the detail what each of these adventures are going to be like. But if you're going after a fire giant, you can probably infer some things about that adventure. You're going to be dealing with a lot of fire, for instance. And they have some control over what kind of adversary do they want to face. Do they want to go after a lowly hill giant, or do they want to go after a fire giant? Now, it's suggested here that the GM can allow the PCs to seek out as many of these giant lords as they want, and that they gain a level for every 2 that they defeat. So like Curse of Strahd, the PCs can kind of control how high level they get in the campaign. They can beeline, through all the story quests and finish at a lower level. Or, in this instance, they can go after all these giant lords, and every 2 that they defeat, they gain a level. So they can kind of control both the difficulty of the campaign and how long they're going to spend with this campaign, which is kind of cool. But I kind of wonder, how many groups are really going to do more than one of these giant lords, and how many are just going to do the one that's required for the story and then move on with the campaign. My guess is most groups will only do one, in which case you've got 4 chapters of this book that you're not going to use. Hopefully you can use it in another campaign, or use them, or at least some of them, or one of them. Ultimately, though, it doesn't matter which giant lord the players choose, as they get the MacGuffin that they need to continue in the campaign from whichever one they go after. Opinions are going to vary on how you feel about that. I kind of have mixed emotions about it myself. So whichever giant lord they go after, assuming they survive and are successful, this leads them to chapter 10 and level 9, or they could possibly proceed directly to chapter 12, or they can get to chapter 12 via chapter 11. So again, there's a bit of a choice how the player characters proceed. So I have mixed reactions, to the structure of this adventure, and I'm guessing that there's going to be a pretty widespread of GM feeling on this. On the one hand, I think chances are good that there will be a decent chunk of this book that you're just not going to use. Now, like me, you may end up wishing that all those wasted pages had been spent on more NPC development, more details of locations in the north, more new monsters and magic items, and things like that. On the other hand, though, this structure may make this campaign a little more useful if you're going to mine it for encounters, locations, and things like that. You could even do this if you run the campaign, because you likely won't use all the encounters or even all of the chapters. So you could use those in future adventures and campaigns. So for instance, I was just talking about chapters 5 to 9, which are these different giant lords. And basically each of these chapters is kind of a standalone adventure, or could be approached in that way, in which you go face a giant lord in his domain, and it's a dungeon, basically. So, if you go through this campaign and you only use one of those, because your player characters went after one of the giant lords, got the MacGuffin, and went on, then, well, you've got 4 adventures that you could use at some later time. Or if you have no intention of running this campaign and you're just looking for things that you can use in your own campaign, the way that it's structured, these adventures are kind of self-contained. So it makes it easier to just grab one of these chapters and plunk it into your own storyline. And there's not as much things that you'll have to deal with doing that. It'll be a lot easier to do that than it would be in, like, say, taking an encounter from Tyranny of Dragons or Curse of Strahd, for instance. Now, I discussed in episode 123 the various innovations in this adventure that I really like. And again, you can go check out episode 123. I'll have it linked in the show notes at starwalkerstudios.com for more information on that. But just real quickly here, I'll tell you that some of those innovations are how treasure is determined and handed out in this adventure, which I really like. Instead of like in previous adventures, telling you every single piece of treasure, a lot of times it's referencing you as the DM to roll on the various tables in the DMG, which I really like because it means that you have more control over the magic items that you hand out, which obviously as a DM, you always have complete control over everything. But a lot of newer DMs seem to need permission from the adventure they're running to, give the player characters a certain magic item, and this does that. Some of the other innovations in this adventure that I really like are the special NPCs and how those work. The Dramatis Personae section given in the beginning where it details all the major NPCs all in one place, which is really nice. The adventure flowchart, which is a must-have in any adventure, I think. The monster roster, I wish they would have done more of these in the adventure, but there's at least one point in the adventure where you're coming upon a dungeon and you're basically given one chart that has all of the monsters in the dungeon, how many of each there is. And this is really handy for helping you keep track of what's still in the dungeon and what the players have defeated and all this stuff. And I'd like to see all adventures do that from now on. And the new giant options. So you're given some new options for giants, which is really cool. I think that this adventure is the most useful of the adventures Wizards has put out so far for 5th edition for DMs who don't ultimately run the adventure. So I know that there's quite a few of us out there who are buying these adventures not because we have any intention of running them, but because there's been so little put out for Dungeons and Dragons 5th edition that we're kind of grasping at straws to have something to work with. In fact, I recently did a poll on the community about who out there is running their own adventures, who out there is running published adventures, who's doing a combination, who's buying published adventures to mine for ideas for their own adventures, things like that. And as part of that, I listed all the official products that have been put out for D&D so far, and I bolded the ones that are adventures. And I believe, if I remember correctly, there are 11 official books, counting the beginner box, put out for D&D. And of those 11, only 4 of them are not adventures. So less, or about a third of the products put out for 5th edition so far have been something other than adventures. So the lion's share of products are adventures. So I feel like even, DMs, and I know that there are DMs out there who aren't running these adventures, but they're buying the books just because it's all there is, right? So that being the case, it's really nice that there are gems in these adventures that you can use if you're not going to run the actual adventure. And hands over fists, Storm King's Thunder has done the best job for those DMs that aren't going to run this campaign, but are looking for things they can use for the campaign that they are running, whether that's locations or maps or encounters or NPCs or magic items or just ideas on how to handle things like handing out treasure or having an NPC that travels with the party or having a monster that travels with the party and different ways to do monsters and things like that. So, if Wizards is going to continue to, just put out adventures for the most part, then I'm glad that they're at least throwing the rest of us a bone a little bit and having something worthwhile in there for those of us that aren't going to run the adventure. So there's a lot of that kind of stuff that can be taken from this book, ideas on how to structure adventures and campaigns, interesting ways to use NPCs and monsters, as well as the actual encounters, locations, NPCs, and things like that. I like how Chapter 3 of the Savage Frontier, which is kind of the sandbox chapter, allows PCs to explore the area and gives you as a GM some cool set encounters and random encounters that you can use. It also gives you a lot of information on locations in the realms. So I think, unfortunately, this is going to ultimately get super annoying for DMs who are running into realms and are relying on 5th edition sources for their realms information. Because right now, if that's you, you're basically getting your information. There's some in Lost Mines of Phandelver. Of course, there's a Sword Coast Adventurer's Guide. About maybe half of that book is realms lore. Hoard of the Dragon Queen, Rise of Tiamat, Princes of the Apocalypse, Out of the Abyss, and now Storm King's Thunder. So it'd be really nice to have all that information in one campaign setting book, as opposed to all these different books, and each one has a chapter or so with information. I just picture the poor DM running into realms in 5th edition who has no experience with the realms before 5th edition, lugging around all these books for a chapter out of each of location information that they're going to use. I feel sorry for that GM. I'm sure that GM's out there. I also like how most of the chapters in this book could again be run as standalone adventures or worked into a completely different campaign. And I really like this approach. And I hope that this is the beginning of a new trend by Wizards, making their published campaigns as useful as possible for GMs not running those campaigns. Almost every chapter in the book could be run as a standalone adventure, and that's really cool. I do think that this campaign finds a decent middle ground between a plotted adventure and a sandbox. I think a true sandbox campaign is really difficult to pull off in a pre-published format. And I also don't think that a pure sandbox campaign is going to be terribly appealing in practice. However, a complete railroad has its issues too. So this campaign is completely ultimately linear, but it's presented in such a way that the players do have some choices of where they want to go, what they want to do. And the campaign provides multiple solutions for the dilemmas presented. For example, when the NPCs need a MacGuffin to get to the final stage of the campaign, they can get it from a variety of giant lords, and they get to pick the one they want to go after. Or they can go after more than one if they want. I also like how, similar to how it's done in Curse of Strahd, the players can somewhat mitigate the difficulty of the campaign. If they want a more challenging campaign, they can charge ahead through the main plot points, the story quests, as you will. If, on the other hand, they want a little less of a challenge, or they want to spend more time with the campaign, or they want to get to higher level, they can pursue optional goals, in this case, defeating all the giant lords and getting some additional levels. I also like that the campaign gives some thoughts on where to go after you finished it. I think more could have be done here, though, and this is something I'd like to see Wizards expand on in future adventures, where to go from here, because these campaigns aren't topping us out at level 20. And I think most players, after they play a player character up to level 15, they're going to want to keep going with that character. They're not going to want to go play a level 1 character again. So, if Wizards isn't going to give us high level campaigns to take us to level 20, which I really wish they would, or at least adventures to pick up where these campaigns leave off and take us to level 20, then at the very least, give us some thoughts on where to go from here. My favorite part of the show is when I hear from listener GMs like you. If you have feedback for the show, whether it's a comment on today's topic or an idea for a future topic, I'd love to hear from you. There are a lot of great ways to get a hold of me. You can email me at gamemastersjourney@gmail.com, follow me on Twitter @LexStarWalker, Google Plus LexStarWalker, and finally, you can visit the website starwalkerstudios.com to get links to my Patreon page, YouTube channel, and more. Finally, you can find a link to the Game Master's Journey Google Plus community at starwalkerstudios.com, and the community is a great place to bounce ideas back and forth with other listener GMs. You can also comment on the show episodes, share your own homebrew world, and ask questions of the many experienced GMs that are part of our community. You can find all this and more at starwalkerstudios.com. All right, we've talked a lot about the structure of the adventure. Let's talk a bit about the story. So, unfortunately, this adventure suffers from the same problem that plagues the other 5th edition adventures by Wizards, which is namely in the hooks. And by hook, I mean your character's motivation for participating in the adventure in the first place. At least for me personally, I think a lot of us, we strive for as much realism and verisimilitude as we can in our RPGs. And part of that is giving the players a good reason that their characters should undertake the adventure that the DM has planned. With a good hook, players should feel that it makes sense for their character to pursue the story. The players should follow the adventure organically without feeling that they're doing something just because that's what the DM wants them to do. The hooks that are given for the PC's involvement in the story of Storm King's Thunder are not very satisfying to me. Ultimately, your players will have to decide to just kind of play along because these hooks won't really hold up for a lot of their characters. The hooks provided aren't convincing and aren't going to make them feel like their character has a true motivation for going on with the adventure. The hooks to pull the PCs into the intro adventure, A Great Upheaval, are pretty standard fare. One involves the PCs hearing there is a reward offered for someone able to deal with a goblin threat. Really? Goblins again? Another involves the PCs hearing they can make money working as guards. But at least it's for a hunt, not for a caravan. The other hook involves PCs traveling to the town to mediate a dispute. Now, what first level party is going to bite on that one? I'm sure they're out there, but I don't know that I've ever run for a first level party that would bite on a hook that involves mediating a dispute. Sounds like a really boring Star Trek The Next Generation episode. The final hook is the PCs hear the inn in the town has great food, I'm not kidding here, and that the innkeeper is good at finding adventuring opportunities. All of these hooks are pretty weak, and if I was a player faced with any of these hooks, I definitely wouldn't be very excited for the campaign or expecting anything really cool to happen in pursuit of these hooks. You know, I would be really counting on hoping that the adventure is not going to be as mundane as the hooks leading me into it. So those are the hooks that get the PCs into this intro adventure, A Great Upheaval, which again kind of feels tacked on. Seems like the adventure really starts at level 5, and this was just thrown in there for those people that insist on starting at level 1. Again, I wonder why. Why are we doing it this way? So maybe that's why the hooks are so bad, right? Well, then we have the hook that guides the PCs from this intro adventure into the main story, the next part of the campaign. And this hook basically boils down to an NPC after, this giant attack that happens in the intro adventure. After this is all resolved, an NPC asks the PCs to travel to one of the 3 locations, whichever one you as the DM have decided to use, to tell a family member of the death of someone lost in the giant attack that just happened, that kicked off A Great Upheaval. Now, this might be a fine hook for some players or groups, but for many groups, I think it's going to fall flat. Players are going to wonder why their characters would travel to some distant town to tell a family they don't know that a relative that they don't know has died. There's no reward offered to the PCs for doing this. And even if there were a reward offered, because you might be like, well, that's an easy fix, I'll just throw in a reward. Even if there were a reward offered, the reward either probably wouldn't be enough to really motivate a profit-minded character to accept the quest, or if the award is enough that such a character would accept the quest, it's really not going to make any sense how this humble NPC would be able to scrape together so much money. And this is a problem we see in a lot of published adventures, which is to say overly rich NPCs. And where do they get all this gold to pay the player characters? But that's a topic for another day, maybe. Instead, the adventure assumes that for some reason, the PCs will agree to do this out of the goodness of their hearts. Even if the party is filled with nothing but goody two-shoe PCs, and how often does that happen? I think it's very likely that they'd have better ideas of more effective ways to spend their time serving the greater good than taking a voyage to inform someone of a family member's death. And again, this isn't anyone important. It's not anyone at all related to the story. You know, there's no reason for them to do this other than the DM wants us to. And that's not a good reason. What's much more likely is that the players are going to agree to do it just to keep the story going because they want to go on the adventure, but they're not going to be satisfied with that. Or the players may refuse the quest and expect you as a DM to give them a better hook. So I would suggest that you have a better hook in your back pocket in case you need it, or better yet, just use that better hook and don't use this lame, oh, can you go travel days away to tell so-and-so that their brother died? Honestly, the only adventure I've seen so far for 5th edition with a halfway decent or at least effective hook was Curse of Strahd. And that hook was basically, you're trapped in Ravenloft now. If you want to go home, you have to do the adventure. Yeah, it's pretty heavy-handed, but at least it makes sense why your character is on the adventure. This adventure also exhibits the problems seen in so many Forgotten Realms adventures, which is namely that feeling that your player character is just tagging along, that it's really the NPCs that are moving the story, not the player characters. The story is really about the NPCs, not the player characters. This is really unfortunate. That said, these deficiencies can all be compensated for by a DM willing to put in the work to make a good campaign, which I hope if you're going to run a campaign, you're willing to put in the work to make a good campaign, which you have to do whether you're coming up with it yourself or you're using a published adventure. You know, I've said many times on the show, running a published adventure is not removing your need to do your homework, DM. So this campaign gives a nice variety of wilderness exploration, overland travel, and dungeon crawling, which is good. Ultimately, this adventure is about solving problems among the giants. Yes, these problems are spilling over and affecting the quote small folk, but at the end of the day, they're giant problems, not human problems or elf problems or dwarf problems. Unfortunately, this is continuing the trend I've seen in Forgotten Realms adventures, in which the PCs seem to be just supporting characters, and the main characters of the story are the NPCs. This is the problem with trying to tie an adventure around some huge meta plot in the world, especially when it's a world that has so many fingers in the pie. It's not your own world. So, you know, the PCs can never be as important as Elminster or Kelvin or whoever. They're always going to be outshined by these NPCs that have books written about them and whatnot. Ultimately, some groups may wonder why they even care about the giants. I could easily see some groups developing a kill them all mentality, going after the giant lords, taking them out, and then ignoring the rest of the adventure. This is probably the way I'd want to handle it as a player if I were presented with this adventure. I'd say, hey, let's hunt ahead, as Bruno or Battlehammer famously said, neutralize the majority of the threat, and then go on to something more relevant to our characters. So some of the other goodies that you get in this product, in addition to the adventure itself, is you do get some new magic items. I counted 17 new magic items. And many of these are rune items using the giant rune magic. So these items usually, you know, have a few abilities, different things that they can do. And then the item can be sacrificed to give an area a permanent magical property. So this is a pretty interesting idea and mechanic that you could use as inspiration for other rune items or just completely different magic items that have this ability where you can destroy the item in order to impart some kind of permanent magical effect. So that's kind of a cool idea that you can just run with. Personally, I wasn't blown away by any of these magic items. None of them are super cool in and of themselves, at least in my opinion. However, I was interested by what was done with the items, and they did give me some ideas for different types of items I could create for my own world and adventures. There are 8 new creatures / NPCs included in this adventure, and these include a legendary elemental, the Tressum, which is a flying house cat that makes kind of an interesting familiar or companion for a PC, if they're into that kind of thing. And the Yak Folk, which are exactly what they sound like. There are also new giant options. So each of the types of true giants are given an additional optional ability or two. So for instance, hill giants have something new that they can do. So you can use these or not as you choose. You could just say that all your hill giants can do this new thing, or maybe just certain really badass hill giants can do it, or maybe just one particular hill giant can do it. And kind of like is the thread throughout this adventure, and what I really love about this adventure is not only, do you get these new abilities that you can use for giants, but it's also kind of opening that door into, hey, I can do this with other monsters. I can come up with completely new abilities for monsters that are either, all the ogres in my world can do this thing that ogres in the monster manual can't do, or only certain ogres can, or only this one ogre can. And it's a great way to keep things interesting, not only for you, but for the players, so that just because they encountered the 1,000th goblin that they've encountered in their career doesn't mean that this goblin can't do something unique that the other goblins couldn't. I think it's great. And, it's great to show you an example of how to do this. And it's also great because it's, again, kind of giving permission for those GMs out there that feel like they need someone to give them permission to do whatever. So this is Wizards kind of giving you permission to say, hey, you can take what we give you in the monster manual and run with it and come up with additional things that these monsters can do. And it's not going to affect their CR, unless you're doing something crazy, which is greatly increasing their damage output or something like that. It's not going to affect their CR. You don't need to worry about that. The CR system for D&D is not that granular that just giving them one new ability is going to make any difference. And it's not that consistent, I would say. There are as many inconsistencies in the CRs of monsters as there are consistencies. So if you're homebrewing stuff, I don't think you need to sweat it that much, honestly. Another little bonus that we're given in this adventure, and again, I discussed this a little more in episode 123, are the special NPCs. And these are NPCs that the players can play in the campaign, or at least at certain parts of the campaign. Now, I'm pointing this out because at the end of the book in the appendices, where you're given little kind of cut out stat cards for these NPCs that you can give to the players when they use them. And these are a great template for you to use anytime you want the players to play an NPC or a monster. And this is a really cool idea that I plan to use myself in my own adventures in the future. I think lots of players are going to be keen to play a monster, even if it's just for a single scene or a single session. And you can see how to do that in Storm King's Thunder. Super cool stuff. All right, so what is the bottom line? I've talked about this a lot. What is the bottom line about this? Is this a book you want to get for your D&D collection? And, like I always say in these reviews, it depends. It depends on you. It depends what you want, what you're looking for, what you want out of this book. So ultimately, I have to grade this book from kind of two different points of view. The first point of view is that of a GM who wants to run this campaign. You're the guy that's like, I want to run Storm King's Thunder. And the second point of view is the GM who doesn't want to run the campaign, but wants to mine this book for ideas, encounters, locations, and maybe just examples of how to put these things together. How do you put together a campaign? So I'm going to kind of approach this from those two different points of view, because I think those two different GMs could have very different opinions on this book. So the first GM, the GM who wants to actually run this campaign, might be a little disappointed. I feel like there are some real missed opportunities in this adventure. Despite there being chapters devoted to alternate encounters, the adventure is still very linear. Some DMs are going to use more of this book than others, depending on the choices the PCs make, depending on, are they completionists? Are they going to do every little quest, or are they going to beeline to the story quests and try to get through the adventure, as efficiently as possible? If a group is very driven to complete the main thrust of the adventure, there may be fairly substantial portions of the book that you just don't touch. I think the biggest missed opportunity, though, is that there just aren't good enough reasons for the PCs to even be on the adventure in the first place, other than just out of the goodness of their hearts. After Curse of Strahd, this feels like a couple steps back to me. I think you could get an awesome campaign out of this, but you're really going to have to spend some time smoothing the rough edges, especially making sure that your PCs have really good reasons to participate in the adventure and to keep participating in the adventure throughout the entire campaign. If you want to run this campaign for your group, I highly recommend having a session 0. Okay, I always recommend having a session 0. Tell your players as much as you can about the campaign without spoiling it. Make sure that they're on board for this kind of thing. Though there will be choices to make, it's going to be largely linear, and I would make them aware of that. Their characters are often going to be playing supporting roles to the NPCs. The story is ultimately about NPCs. It's not about the player characters. Make sure they're okay with that. Now, if all the players are on board with all of that, I think you can have a lot of fun with it. I'd also make it very clear to the players that there is this lack of a ticking clock and that they can and should take their time to explore. If they just beeline through the campaign, they're going to miss a lot. And you're not going to get a lot of value out of it as the GM who shelled out money to buy this book. So encourage them to take their time and explore and all that good stuff and just, enjoy the world and explore and just go where they feel like going. Do what they feel like doing. Again, this isn't really something that's spelled out in the story. It is spelled out for the DM, but it's not spelled out to the player characters. So, you're going to want to tell them this if you want them to know that and not feel like, oh, we got to hurry up and deal with this before the giants kill everybody. And again, it's very metagamey. In story, in character, there's no reason that the player characters would ever think that there's not a ticking clock, that this isn't urgent. I mean, villages are being destroyed, people are being killed. It seems like this is something we should probably deal with now and not next month. So it's very metagame for you to be like, hey guys, a big part of this adventure is sandboxy and assumes you're going to explore and kind of ignore all the atrocities happen and feel like you have all the time in the world to deal with them. So kind of try to approach it in that way, even though it doesn't really make sense in character. Otherwise, I don't feel like I got my money's worth for this book. All right, now the second GM, the GM who wants to mine this book for ideas and material, I think she's going to be really happy with this book. I'm really happy with this book coming from that point of view. I'm probably not going to run this campaign, if only just because I don't have the time. But I was hoping to get some ideas for Primordia from this because I want giants to be a big part of what's going on in Primordia. And although I'm actually not a fan of the actual story, it's a little too top down for me. I don't know. It seems very contrived. The whole backstory seems very contrived to me. So I wouldn't use that. But as far as the encounters and the adventures and the NPCs and the innovations and how this adventure is put together and some of what's done, there's a lot that I can use, right down to just grabbing a whole dungeon out of this and putting it in one of my own stories. So again, I think the GM who's wanting to mine this for ideas is going to be very happy with it. You've got a lot of encounters to go through, and some of them are really good and fun. There are random encounters, and some of those are really imaginative as well. You're given some really fleshed out NPCs that you can use in your own stories. There aren't any new spells or character options or anything like that, but there are the new magic items. Also, this idea of letting players play important NPCs and giants or other monsters is really cool. And you can see how you can do that for yourself. And you're also given quite a few locations that you can use as well. And finally, if you are a GM running into Forgotten Realms, especially if you're new to the realms, If you're not familiar with the realms from, say, like 3rd edition or 2nd edition or 1st edition, then you're going to get some more information on locations in the north. Hell, if you've collected all the adventures so far and the Sword Coast Adventurer's Guide, you probably have a decent source book for the north. Unfortunately, you're going to have to drag around something like 6 hardcover books to have access to all of that instead of just one book, but it's there. So if you're looking for encounters, locations, NPCs, and just ideas and examples on how to do things, I think you're going to be very satisfied with this book. I really like how much value you can get from Storm King's Thunder without running the adventure. I really hope that this is something Wizards continues to do and expands on in the future. Personally, I'd like to see future campaigns be about the same page count as this book, but be shorter campaigns and fill those extra pages left over with more NPCs, locations, backgrounds, random encounters and tables, magic items, spells, and things like that. I also like how they gave some examples on how to expand the adventure, for instance, by creating your own giant lords for the PCs to face, in addition to the ones that are given. And this is something else that I hope to see more of in the future, and I hope to see more done with this, more examples of here's how to make this your own. Here's where you could throw in an extra NPC or a location or whatever. Give us ideas and examples of how we can take the campaign in different directions and make it our own, or how we can follow along with the players when they take it in a different direction. One of the problems with these adventures for 5th edition, in my opinion, is that they're so ungodly long. The longer an adventure is, the less likely that a given group is going to finish it. I'd much rather have a shorter adventure with a higher chance of completing it and then have more supplemental material provided as far as how to get to this adventure from where I was before, where to go after the adventure is over, as well as different ways that the adventure can go. Don't make it so linear. Give me some options. So there's my bottom line. I guess I have 2 bottom lines. If you're wanting to run the campaign, I think your mileage is going to vary. It's going to depend on your group and how much they really dig into it, how much of it you use. And also as a DM, are you fine with it buying an adventure book like this and not using 6 chapters of it? Then you're going to be fine with it. But if you're someone who pays X amount for a book, for an adventure, and you feel like you should get value out of every single page, and you have a group that just tears through it and doesn't explore everything, then you may not be so satisfied. If, on the other hand, you're a GM who isn't really interested in running this adventure necessarily, but you're just looking for ideas and inspirations and different things you can do with the system, I think you're going to be very pleased with this. And it can provide you with a lot of inspiration. Again, the entirety of the content of episode 123 was after I just read like the introductory chapters in the book and was blown away with how much I could take from that and all the great ideas that they gave me. Not even so much adventure ideas, but just how to run the game and different things you can do within the game. So as for me personally, I'm very happy with this book. I'm very glad that I have it, even though I probably won't ever run the campaign. I'm definitely going to be using ideas I gained from this book, ideas like having players play important NPCs or even monsters, how to have a powerful monster that tags along with the party for a while without completely stealing the show, different ideas for different types of magic items, ideas for how to approach handing out loot and treasure in the game, and also, some good examples of kind of mixing together linear or plot directed and sandbox or open-ended elements and how you can kind of transition from one to the other and can use them to support one another. So I'm getting a lot from this book, completely satisfied with it, even if I never run the campaign. And even if I never run the campaign, I think it's pretty likely that at some point in my GMing career, I'm going to use at least some of the encounters, if not some of the whole adventures from this book, and use them in my own story. For instance, the adventure where the player characters go after the giant lord who's a fire giant, I'm really digging, and already have a way that I could put that into one of my Primordia campaigns that I'm planning, and it fits it like a glove. So if you're planning to run this, or you're thinking about running it, I would definitely recommend flipping through the book and spending some time with it and deciding if, this is the kind of adventure for you, if you're going to enjoy running it. I have to say that when I first got this book and I started looking at it, I was really excited about the adventure because it's a little more classic D&D to me than Curse of Strahd. My most recent thing I was running was Curse of Strahd, which is Gothic horror, and it's very low magic. The PCs don't come across very many magic items, and the ones that they do come across tend to be not till the very end of the campaign. Where this is much more kind of high fantasy, where the PCs are coming across magic and magic items much earlier and much more often, and is just kind of more in line with the kind of campaign I like to run. So very excited in that regard. And I have kicked around the ideas of, trying to convert this to Primordia. Again, I would change the underpinning story of it, because I'm not a fan of the underpinning story. I think it's pretty weak, actually. But using the encounters in the adventures and just coming up with a different framework as far as story-wise, why these things are happening in the world, which I would want to do for Primordia anyway, because this is very much couched in the Forgotten Realms. I'm sure it makes sense for the Forgotten Realms, but I don't think it'd make much sense for Primordia. And you want to make it your own, right? I don't want to feel like I just transplanted part of the realms into Primordia. And, for me, running it as written is not terribly appealing, just because I'm not a fan of the realms and I've kind of had my fill of it. But that said, if you are a fan of the realms, or you are running in the realms, I think you're going to find this adventure extremely appealing, because it does tie into some of the history of the realms. And it does allow your player characters to be involved in some pretty, earth-shaking events that are happening in the realms. Unfortunately, they are ultimately kind of side characters in that story, which is unfortunate. I don't know why we can't have adventures where the PCs are actually what the story is about. I guess maybe because Wizards doesn't know who your PCs are. I don't know. But it is historical stuff. And finally, for those of you running in the realms, and maybe for other GMs as well, this does follow on the events of Tyranny of Dragons. Now, you can't really run your group through Tyranny of Dragons and then have them do Storm King's Thunder with the same characters, because again, by the end of Tyranny of Dragons, you're 15th, 16th, maybe 17th level. So, I don't think Storm King's Thunder would be too much fun if you're playing it starting out at 17th level. Probably be pretty boring, but it would be cool to do it with the same group and start new characters, because the events and outcome of Rise of Tiamat and Horde of the Dragon Queen do lead to the events that set the stage for this adventure. And I do like that, in theory, at least, that these adventures are tying together somewhat. I just really wish it wasn't Forgotten Realms. I really wish that, I don't know, if they just made it setting neutral would have been ideal, so that you could take this and use it in any world, or at least picked a more, I don't know, a less screwed up world like Greyhawk than Forgotten Realms. But that's just my personal taste and opinion. But I do think it's cool how they're tying them together. I think if you're running in something other than the realms and you're, translating these adventures over, that may be more difficult to do, or it may not be. I guess it depends how much you're having to change things to make it fit in your world. So yeah, this is definitely worth checking out. Again, for the GM that's looking for this, for inspiration and ideas and things to use in your campaign that you're already running, maybe in your homebrew world or in Forgotten Realms or in another world, I think this is definitely something you're going to want to take a look at and something you're going to really enjoy having access to. If you're a GM looking to run the campaign itself, it's not the strongest campaign Wizards has put out. I'd say that would be Curse of Strahd, but it's not the weakest campaign they put out either. Somewhere in the middle. So I would definitely recommend, if you're wanting to run it, taking a look at it and seeing if this is a storyline you really want to commit that kind of time to, and see if it's something your players are going to enjoy. So yeah, ultimately these reviews, it's up to you. It's your decision. I can't tell you if this is worth your money or not. All I can do is try to tell you kind of what's in here, what this is and what this isn't, and what my opinions are. And hopefully that will help you make your own informed decision. All right, well, that is going to wrap up episode 126 and the conclusion of my review on Storm King's Thunder. Let me know what you think of this adventure, what you think of the book, and let me know which of those GMs are you? Are you running this or planning to run this, or are you just using it for more ideas and things for your own game? And let me know what you think of it. And, if anybody has something new to say or something to point out that I overlooked, I will definitely share that with the listeners as well. Now, before we completely end the show today, I do have a special treat for you. I hope you stuck around for the end of the show to get the special treat. I actually meant to mention this at the beginning of the episode, and I forgot, but that's okay. This is a reward for those of you that actually listen to the whole episode. So I recently became aware of a very talented musician who has a YouTube channel. His name is Rustage, and he recently made a awesome song about being a dungeon master. I really enjoyed it, and he gave me permission to share it with you on the show today. So I'm going to play that for you now. And as I said, he's got a YouTube channel with lots more music videos. I will have his channel linked in the show notes, and if I can, I'm going to embed this video in the show notes at starwalkerstudios.com so that you can see the music video that goes with this song, because it's quite entertaining. But this is all about being a dungeon master.
Yeah. Rustage. Schwabadi. Let's go.
I'm the dungeon master, I'm the dungeon master. You see me rolling dice and drumming up disaster. Dungeon master, I'm the dungeon master. Better think twice before you rogue a spellcaster. Ha! Welcome to my playground. You better be ready to battle the baddies that I gotta make now. Fool, do you know who you're talking to? I control this kingdom, the king, you're vermin on my shoe. You think you'll prove your worth? I'd like to see you try. Catching your fist with the hope that you're rolling a number that's higher than mine. So welcome to my earth, I see you find it fine. I see that you're missing, you should have been quitting with all of the skills of divine. Claiming victory, take a look at my history. Play the books with no trickery. You hoping you can spit at me or always end in misery. Don't fail the delivery, I hope you show ability inside my game of D&D. Dungeon master, I'm the dungeon master. You see me rolling dice and drumming up disaster. Dungeon master, I'm the dungeon master. Better think twice before you rogue a spellcaster. Dungeon master, I'm the dungeon master. You see me rolling dice and drumming up disaster. Dungeon master, I'm the dungeon master. Better think twice before you rogue a spellcaster.
Suicide to deny a dungeon master's will, unless you're vying for guys up with intent to kill. I've been trying to kick it back and keep chillin', before I realize the DM is the real villain. Before you turn the corner, boy, you better roll stealth, because you're hurting and flirting with death on 10 health. Watching you step for the danger of death, tripping on wires, the traps have been set. Every shadow a possible threat, pain is imbued in every breath. This dude's a psycho, he's a sadist.
Yeah, that's true, I dropped 2 of your bodies just in the last room.
Is that an ogre? The cleric's down, the wizard too. It's game over, we all dance to the master's tune.
Dungeon Master, I'm the Dungeon Master. You see me rolling dice and drumming up disaster. Dungeon Master, I'm the Dungeon Master. Better think twice, be you rogue or spellcaster. Dungeon Master, I'm the Dungeon Master. You see me rolling dice and drumming up disaster. Dungeon Master, I'm the Dungeon Master. Better think twice, be you rogue or spellcaster. I leave you fighting orcs, trolls and goblins. Maybe a basilisk or a rug or smothering. Unleash your hell of skeletons, maybe a devil, almanac, a cobbled mage, hagrid, I'll throw another golem in. Unleash the dragon, you'll be burnt alive. Won't survive, traveling into the battle ring. You know what's happening, it is your time to die. Release the kraken, attacking your guys back into where you reside. Hope you're not cracking under the endless tide. Dungeon Master, I'm the Dungeon Master. You see me rolling dice, I'm drumming up disaster. Dungeon Master, I'm the Dungeon Master. Better think twice, be you rogue or spellcaster. Dungeon Master, I'm the Dungeon Master. You see me rolling dice, I'm drumming up disaster. Dungeon Master, I'm the Dungeon Master. Better think twice, be you rogue or spellcaster. Dungeon Master, I'm the Dungeon Master. You see me rolling dice, I'm drumming up disaster. Dungeon Master, I'm the Dungeon Master. Better think twice, do you rogue or spellcaster? Dungeon Master, I'm the Dungeon Master. You see me rolling dice, I'm drumming up disaster. Dungeon Master, I'm the Dungeon Master. Better think twice, be you rogue or spellcaster.
Once again, thank you so much to Rustage for letting me play that. I really enjoy that song, and I think that it could easily be the theme song of this podcast, but that might be taking things too far. I don't know if Rustage would be happy about that, but I wish it could be my theme song, because this is definitely a podcast about being the game master or the dungeon master. And a lot of fun. And again, head to the show notes at starwalkerstudios.com. Check out the show notes for this episode 126, and check out Rustage's YouTube channel. He's got loads of great videos there. Very talented musician, and hopefully he'll be doing some more RPG related stuff in the future. And if so, I'll definitely let you know. But definitely check out his YouTube channel. And thank you again, sir, for letting me play that on the show. So I hope that you have a chance to play your favorite RPG this week. I'll be back soon with another episode of Game Master's Journey. Until then, game on.
This has been a Starwalker Studios production, your source for quality gaming and hobby podcasts.
This episode's music courtesy of Cloudwalker, Transboy, Renfield, Stanko, and Ish. See the show notes for more details at starwalkerstudios.com/Game Master's Journey.